I'd like to invite you to take your seats again as we gather for our afternoon session. Oh, thank you. Phil Gillespie has asked for just a couple of minutes.
Greetings, everyone. I want to just share with you an opportunity for you and members of your congregation or men within your congregation, because I just don't ever want you to be bored, okay? So I always, everything I do, I always have your best interests at heart, okay? So what I'd like to do is share with you an opportunity today. And I don't know if you've heard, but a year ago we embarked on a new project. It was the Trails End project. We were replacing one of the Trails End cabins. And we ran into a few challenges with that project. And I don't really want to go in, and you don't want to hear the challenges in all of their detail, trust me. But it is one that is being fixed. And I will tell you, it's being fixed largely through the efforts of one individual, Bruce Osley. So Tina's husband, Bruce, has been a God-given saint to us here at Briarwood. And he right now has basically agreed. I went to him and said, Bruce, can you ramrod this project for me to get it completed and finished and ready for summer camp? And he accepted that challenge. And then he came and looked at the cabin and discovered what a challenge he had embraced. So at any rate, tremendous progress is being made, but he really could use some help. And I could use some help for Bruce so that this cabin is completed appropriately, rightly, and can really support kids this summer. So Mark Hander, also a God-given saint to Briarwood, has been helping in a variety of ways. And he and I met with Bruce earlier this morning, kind of put together a little bit of a schedule, if you will, of things and to try to make this request specific. And so I have spread those around. Mark, you've passed out a few. We've got some projects in this whole thing that need to be done. And on that calendar, if you'll look at it, and Mark, you wrote it up for me, so tell me what we're doing is we've got first of all, we've got needs for any volunteers, retired people who have any kind of desire, interest, willingness to work on a construction project. They don't necessarily have to be skilled. Just helpers would make a big deal to Bruce. And so we've got, we can use 2 or 3 helpers pretty much every day of the week. So if you had some retired folks who might be willing and able and capable and desirous to help, we sure could use that help. So I want to kind of lift that up to you. Also then on Saturday the 22nd, we're looking for some folks that might have some carpentry type skills to build a couple platforms on the side entrances. A couple contributions might be helpful as well, but we'll take whatever we can get to make that happen. We also are going to be needing to finish tiling the floors in the bathroom and also preparing the exterior walls for painting. So we're going to try to do that on the 22nd. So if you've got a group of men or women or just a team that can come and help, we've got some work on the 22nd that can be done. On the 29th, we want to try to construct some enclosures on the hot water heaters. They're actually on the side of the building. They're the tankless hot water heater systems, but they need enclosures built. So if you've got some folks in your congregation who could take on a project like that and work with Bruce, that also would be helpful. And we've got to do the finish work. We've got to get doors hung, baseboards hung, that sort of work. That we're going to do on the 29th, and we're shooting for a final inspection on April the 4th. So we're nearing completion, but we have those specific events. Then we got a few other items that could be front porch work needs to be done. We can do that after the final inspection. And we've got some landscaping work, and if people really want to get ambitious, we're going to tear up some some carpet and replace it with tile. That's just a couple possibilities that exist out there. So we've got a lot of things to do. Bruce and a group, he's had a lot of volunteers help him, but we could use some more. We can get that cabin online. So if you could help, if you'll pass that word out in your congregations, it would mean a great deal to me, because we would be helping a real angel here at Briarwood. And so I just want to say, and I'm going to publicly again say to Tina, and I've said this to Bruce, but Tina, please, and express to Bruce our deep appreciation for his efforts, because it really, really is helping. And anything anybody can do to help us move this forward it would be deeply appreciated. And I'm sitting here and I'm looking at Kathy Johnson. Her husband has become our volunteer electrician to finish out the electrical work, and Jesus Escamilla has finished out the plumbing work for us, or will be. So we've had some number of skilled laborers come in to do specific projects for us at the completion of this cabin. So a great deal of work and a great deal of appreciation goes out to everyone. Thanks for your time.
With that, we'll invite Dr. Campbell to join us again for our afternoon, hopefully sessions 3 and 4.
Yes, well, in fact, I am going to, maybe I set you up for this, but I am going to basically do 3 and part of 4 together and see if I can set this up. Now, the problem I realize is that I should really have the spiffiest graphics and dancing monkeys and whatever for the afternoon session when, this is the worst time of the day to be speaking and so forth. And unfortunately, all I've got is traditional professor overhead type slide things, and I don't have a lot of images, so I'm going to have to think of ways to jazz this up and so forth, but I will do my best to talk a bit about the strengths of old line churches, mainline churches in the United States, and some of the ways forward, perhaps edifying practices in which we could engage. And I'll basically show you why I'm struggling with part of that. But I want to begin talking about our strengths. I think we need to play to our strengths. The best defense is a strong offense. I don't know why I'm thinking about basketball these days, but it's where SMU is. But, a lot of the misrepresentations of our churches, my first reaction would be to go and argue with someone and say, no, you're misrepresenting our churches. It's not like that. It's like this. But that's probably really not a good way to go. I think what we need to do is put our strengths forward, and that would be the better way to look for a better representation. So I'm going to say several things about our churches. The first one I probably do not need to convince Lutherans about, but I would say one of our great strengths is our confessional and liturgical traditions. I, as a United Methodist, have a great struggle over this because I'm the author of the leading textbook on United Methodist doctrine, and when I say doctrine, I really mean doctrine as corporate consensus about what to teach. United Methodists have a very bad habit of thinking we're a really great church because we don't have doctrines, we don't have confessions, and the truth is we do, and we remove clergy for dissemination of doctrine contrary to our present and existing standards of doctrine, and we even have provisions for removing lay people, although it's been since the 1970s that we've successfully removed a lay person for dissemination of doctrine contrary to our present and existing standards of doctrine. But I probably don't need to make the case so much to you. We do have distinctive traditions of Christian confession and worship. Anglicans inherited the traditions of the Book of Common Prayer. Various Lutheran groups have inherited Scandinavian and German patterns for prayer that have been anglicized in some ways, sort of mixed with the traditions of the Book of Common Prayer, but also all of us influenced by ecumenical movements in recent history. Methodists, and I really mean here AME, AME Zion, CME, and United Methodist, all inherited liturgical forms that came from the period of the English Reformation, and those have pretty much persisted. We've actually had a debate within Methodist circles about did we really completely go away from the liturgical forms in the 19th century. Some scholars argued, I think without a lot of evidence, that we did. But one of the interesting things is we've never had books of worship like a Book of Common Prayer. We just write it into the hymnal, and the hymnal is the Methodist book, of course. And it was also written into the little book of discipline that Methodist clergy would carry with them that had the ritual as part of it. So one of our interesting phenomena as Methodists is that if you go to African American United Methodist churches or AME, AME Zion, CME churches, first Sunday of every month is observed as the Lord's Supper. I presume Jesus said that to his apostles at some point, and that we always follow that. I was shocked to learn that some Methodists outside of Texas don't actually follow that custom. in almost all of these churches, the old language of the 1662 Book of Common Prayer prevails as the standard services, even when the congregation never sees it written out on paper. My friend Bill Turner at Duke University is an apostle. He is an ordained apostle. He's the only apostle I have as a friend. And Bill wrote the history of the United Holy Church of America, which is a Pentecostal holiness denomination prevalent in North Carolina, historically black church. Bill says they have never seen a prayer book in that denomination, but when they celebrate Holy Communion, what they expect the minister to say is, "Ye that do truly and earnestly repent ye of your sins and are in love and charity with your neighbors and intend to lead a new life following the commandments of God and walking from henceforth in His holy ways, draw near with faith and take this holy sacrament to your comfort, making your humble confession before Almighty God, meekly kneeling upon your knees." It's just, they've got it down, and you've got to learn those words. So there's an oral remembering of the liturgical tradition, which you can make a case is the way liturgical traditions were carried on in the early church and even in the medieval church, when a deacon was basically just a person in the process of memorizing the liturgy, and a priest was one who had finally memorized the whole thing. Presbyterians have a distinctive set of liturgical traditions that have come from Scottish and Scots-Irish Presbyterian churches. Baptists, not so strong, but that leads me to say that one of the things that's happened along the way in the 20th century is that the ecumenical movement has led all of our churches to be clearer about our common confession of the Christian faith and our common liturgical inheritance, as we have revised that in collaboration with ecumenical folks. One of the first times I recognized this was when I attended my brother Glenn's wedding. Now, yes, Glenn Campbell is my brother, and he was married, my brother Glenn Campbell was married down in Austin at St. David's Episcopal Church downtown. And I realized for the first time in that October, I think 1988, 1989, that I didn't need to look at the Book of Common Prayer to follow the Episcopal liturgy for the Lord's Supper, because our service is so similar that when the priest said, "The Lord be with you," I knew what to say in response. And when they said the mystery of faith, and we said, "Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again," we just knew what was coming. And that's a sign of the extent to which we've grown together. Now I will make another confession to you, sisters and brothers of the ELCA Church. You notice I'm only going halfway when I do that. It's kind of a halfway confession, right? United Methodists like to act like we've always had a long liturgical and confessional tradition. There is a sense in which that's true, and I'm one of the historians who's documented that. The truth is, just to give you one very specific example, we have not used the Nicene Creed except since the 1960s. The 1964 Methodist hymnal was the first Methodist hymnal to include the Nicene Creed. It is not mentioned in our articles of religion as it is for Anglicans and for others. You have it, I think, at the beginning of the Book of Concord, the three creeds that are traditionally included there in Lutheran symbolic or confessional books. And the truth is, I think I'm right in saying Presbyterians traditionally did not use the Nicene Creed. Methodists and Presbyterians both use the Apostles' Creed, and Methodists have a quirky thing about it traditionally not saying that Christ descended to hell or descended to the place of the dead, basically because of misunderstanding about it. We now include the Nicene Creed not only in our hymnals, but as of our 1988 hymnal, 89 published hymnal, it's in the first place. It comes before the Apostles' Creed. And when we say when we say the Apostles' Creed in the confirmation service, it always includes the words, "He descended to the place of the dead." Because whatever conflicts we may have had about that language in the past, we've come to recognize through ecumenical contact that is the ecumenical form of the creed, and we don't want to be confirming our youth into some sort of odd Methodist version of that. And we've come to recognize, as other churches have, that the Nicene Creed really is the most ecumenical of Christian creeds. It's just because the Eastern churches have never used the Apostles' Creed, which was in its origins a Latin baptismal creed. So it's a sign of the extent to which, through the 20th century, our ecumenical commitments, I think, have helped all of our churches. That may be less obvious to Episcopalians and Lutherans than it is to Methodists and Presbyterians. I would say to you, though, that if you're familiar, we're over it, and I wish we were at least as far along as the ELCA has come to be in that issue. Despite those divisive issues, though, I think we need to recognize our conservatisms as a strength of our churches, and in some ways to celebrate that. Most of the old line or mainline churches in the United States have got two very distinctive forms of conservatism that came into tension with each other in the 1820s and the 1830s. From the previous century, from the 18th century, were a series of pietistic or evangelical movements that basically emphasized two things. One is the unmediated authority of the Scriptures. That is to say, the Bible speaks to us without the need for a church magisterium telling us what the Bible means, without the need for that means there has to be some truth to this, I feel. But most Episcopalians and Lutherans that I know don't lean toward this particular. A guy named C.I. Scofield, who had a very interesting effect on the history of these evangelical groups, but his form of conservatism affected more Presbyterians and Baptists than Methodists. But that's one form of conservatism. From the 1820s and the 1830s, though, there was a different form of took me a long time as a Methodist to figure out that those were both in some ways expressions of the same movements. But the old Lutheran churches, the churches that decided to break apart from the national Prussian church because of their strong Lutheran identity and their desire not to be forced into a union with Reformed folks, which is to say, what you know is the folks who got on boats and came that afternoon and hung around and took pictures and so forth, because that's so important. All of these movements, there's a book called Creed and Confession about these parallel movements among Anglicans, Reformed, and Lutherans in the 1820s and 30s and beyond that emphasized the kind of liturgical and confessional form of conservatism. Those conservatisms have been in tension with each other through a lot of our history. I will tell you, my real struggle as a United Methodist is that I'm a conservative and I'm a liberal and I'm all kinds of things all at once. But my conservative leaning is toward the more liturgical and confessional side of it. And most United Methodist conservatives lean toward the evangelical pietistic side of conservatism. And so we feel like a lonely little crowd sometimes who sort of lean toward this form of conservatism in our churches. But the conservatisms that we have, I think, are legacies in our churches, not widely recognized in the stereotype of mainline churches as liberal and faithless and so on and so forth that we were looking at earlier. I think people need to know about this. I think they need to know we have traditions of conservatism. There are particular ways of being conservatives for Methodists and Lutherans and others. And those are not bad things. They're part of our heritage, and they have not always stood in tension with our progressive commitments. So that brings me to another strength, I think, the strength of our churches and our progressive commitments. Speaking as a historian now, Methodists, Presbyterians, Baptists, perhaps to some extent Episcopalians, had a particular view of the second coming of Jesus that prevailed in the 1800s, really even in the 1700s and before. I don't know if this is true of Lutherans or not, so you can tell me, but it's what we traditionally call post-millennialism. And post-millennialism means, you got this 1,000-year period in the Revelation. It means Jesus is not going to come until after the millennium. So the way they interpreted it, logically conservative Baptist pastor, but he took up this premillennial view. Now, in the premillennial view, Jesus is going to come immediately. Jesus is going to come before the millennium, and in the millennium, all hell is going to break loose on earth. The earth is basically going to hell, so the implication of premillennial, but it put the emphasis on social interaction and involvement. From about the 1890s, associated with a Chicago evangelist named D.L. Moody, Dwight Lyman Moody, a different view prevailed. It's what we call premillennialism. One of the leading advocates of premillennialism was a Fort Worth Baptist pastor at First Baptist Church in Fort Worth named L. Frank Norris. No, I think it's J. Frank, because it always sounds like J. Frank Dobie, and that's really not who he was. But J. Frank Norris was a very conservative, politically conservative, theologically conservative Baptist pastor, but he took up this premillennial. The earth is basically going to hell, so the implication of premillennialism is you don't need to build hospitals. They're irrelevant. Jesus is coming maybe next week, maybe next month. You don't need universities. You don't need inner-city missions. The only thing you need is an evangelistic mission that will save people's souls so they believe in Jesus, and when Jesus comes next week or next month, they will be raptured up to heaven with the saints. So you see, they're arguing about the second coming of Jesus, but the real sort of the takeaway from it is, how do Christians engage in the world? How are you engaged in the struggles of the city, the countryside, and so forth? Well, the older postmillennial view had been the dominant view of American evangelicals through the 1800s, really of American Protestants. There's a very good book about this by a Princeton theologian named James Moorhead, and it's called World Without End, and it gives a kind of overview of this postmillennial view. In the early 20th century, when evangelicals increasingly went toward premillennialism and sort of moved away from concrete engagement with social issues, a lot of Protestant at that time by more conservative evangelical groups in the United States. To his great credit, one of the leading fundamentalists, Henry, what was his name? He wrote a book called The Troubled Conscience of a Fundamentalist in the 1950s, and he argued that the fundamentalists, evangelicals in general, were taking the wrong view of the civil rights movement. They were basically on the morally wrong side of the civil rights movement by not supporting the positive movement for civil rights in the United States. Can't believe I'm getting to the point, though, where so much information is in my head that other stuff is falling out, right? That's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it. Can't remember his name, but he's the founder of Christianity away now. These churches were engaged with the women's movement in the 1970s beyond, and have shown strength of having women in ordained and other ministries, though in our church, women continue to face the kind of glass ceiling phenomenon that I think women in other denominations have faced. In our church, it's an interesting thing, though, because you may know for Methodists, our very conservative wing in the early 20th century was the holiness movement, and the holiness movement tended to have women in ordained ministry from the very beginning. Church of the Nazarene is the largest holiness denomination, founded in Pilot Point, not too terribly far from here, in 1911, October the 12th, I think. 25% of their ordained ministry was women at the very beginning. I think it's now just 5% or something like that, so it's actually been a regression. You can lay out Methodist groups at the beginning of the 20th century, and it almost goes exactly right from most conservative to most liberal in terms of when they ordained women to the full ministry of word and sacrament. In the popular image of our churches is my final bullet point here, and that's that, as you know, as all of you know, I think, progressive commitments have not always come at the cost of compromises in liturgical and confessional commitments. I think there's a sense that if you allow for the ordination of gay and lesbian people, you've somehow throttled or gotten rid of the Bible and all of your traditional commitments, and it's just going to be singing Kumbaya and let there be peace on earth from now on out. You probably know that some of the leaders of the civil rights movement were more theologically and liturgically traditional people. Many of us who have supported feminist movements and other movements have traditional commitments. So I'm very comfortable saying I'm a conservative with respect to liturgical and confessional commitments. I'm very comfortable saying I'm much more progressive with respect to the social commitments of the church. Now, that's just me. That's Ted. But on the other hand, my church allows that. And I would say mainline churches in general have allowed these combinations of political and social progressivism with more traditional theological views. Next, we have institutions for the transmission of cultures. The counterexample I've already given is the closing and sale of the Crystal Cathedral. The question I raise is whether Schuller's enterprise failed to transmit a church culture beyond a generation. Now, there is a thing about church-related institutions that I'm very well aware of, having spent most of my life either being trained by church-related institutions or serving as a faculty member or a president of a church-related institution. What we know is that church-related institutions, especially educational institutions, very seldom require all members of the faculty to be practicing members of that group. I mean, it's true in varying degrees with different church institutions. Did you know that Baylor University, for example, has an interesting requirement that all their faculty must be Christians or Jews? It's a very interesting way to put it. Muslims and atheists are not allowed, but Christians and Jews, and there is a kind of latitude within the Baylor University faculty along the lines that their own charter lays out. And by the way, that's not just since Baylor became separate from the Baptist Convention of Texas. That's been a long-standing principle at that university. University, for most of the university's life, you would never know that it was a Methodist university except for the M and the word Methodist in our name. But what I also know is that Perkins School of Theology, the chaplaincy of the university, Bridwell Library have served as a way of carrying on and reflecting critically on Methodist tradition, Methodist history, and so forth. I suspect you could say the same thing for a lot of Lutheran institutions, Texas Lutheran University and Seguin, Lutheran theological seminaries, and so forth. We transmit church cultures, not as the thing the whole university does, but as we like to say it, we don't want it in one way or another, typically through the theology faculty, the library resources they have, the church-related hospitals, clinics, inner-city ministries, camps, centers for spiritual formation. This institute that we're at right here, Briar Grove, I understand y'all bought this from the Presbyterians, but it stood for a long time as an institution where church culture sort of gives you a space where church cultures can be transmitted. I do think sometimes we need to renegotiate our contracts with church-related institutions. We have a group in the United Methodist Church called the University Senate that accredits United Methodist-related college chance to minister to them. Final strength, I would say, is new forms of evangelization. Lutherans probably haven't gone as far with this as some United Methodist groups have gone, but we did experiment with contemporary Christian models since the 1990s. One of the interesting things that's happened in Dallas in the last few years, very controversial, is that the very young pastor of the contemporary Methodist but doesn't really have any organic connection to the churches. But you might be surprised. I mean, I know people who are administrators at the huge Methodist hospital system in Houston, and they really have maintained organic connections to the churches and lines of responsibility and ways in which they serve as kind of chaplains to, well, you might think of it as chaplains to the nuns who show up there at the hospital with serious issues, and we get a chance to minister to them. Final strength, I would say, is new forms of evangelization. Lutherans probably haven't gone as this as some United Methodist groups have gone, but we did experiment with contemporary Christian models since the 1990s. Dr. Paul Rasmussen built a very strong ministry there, utilizing contemporary Christian worship styles, but also contemporary liturgical styles. One of the coolest things he did, and you can take a note about this, is that he made up bathroom posters, and I happen to know that in the men's room, they're right over the urinal, so you're sort of forced to read. And what he's got going is that the theological topics that he's preaching on and the liturgical seasons, he's got really graphically well-done posters that are there in public places, including the bathrooms, that mention my colleague Elaine Heath, who has the office directly above me at Perkins School of Theology. Elaine is experimenting with what she calls new monastic communities and forming communities of Perkins students and other people in the community in especially challenged areas of Dallas. For example, an apartment complex next to the school where my wife had served as librarian. Some of these folks have moved into the apartment complex. They have services available to folks there. A lot of immigrants from Nigeria and other places moving in, and they're showing some new ways to build a Christian community there. So I think our churches have strengths, and we need to communicate that. If you don't mind, I'm just going to move on and mention 2 or 3 of my edifying practices. So I'm going to go on to some of the practices that, again, this is a historian looking in an engaging struggle between what of tradition he wanted to retain and what he thought needed to be emphasized in the churches. One specific way of innovation has been the use of popular performance cultures in worship or worship-like meetings. Now, this may not be the point where Lutherans are the most engaged. We just had a conference at SMU at Perkins called Popular Performance Cultures and Not in Formal Worship Settings. What we call gospel music is music that echoed the popular performance of Victorian music halls back in the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s. Methodists and Baptists and Presbyterians all got into it, but typically not in worship. Again, they built other settings in which they utilized those popular performance cultures to draw in people to their churches. So the issue of contemporary Christian worship in the 1980s and 1990s, what we sometimes call the worship wars of the 1990s, in a sense sometimes fail to recognize that that was just part of a long ongoing dialogue between performance cultures and Christian worship. I argue, though, that there has been a consistent core of Christian worship practices that has remained relatively consistent over the centuries, and which ecumenical engagement, including with Catholics in the last half century, has revealed to us more and more consistently. And I would say, moreover, that core of practices has almost nothing to do with particular styles of music or other ways of communicating the gospel in churches. My particular paper in this conference on performance cultures was on John Wesley's actual way of performing sermons. And what I've discovered is he was a performer from the word go. I mean, he knew about how actors acted out parts and how the face and the hands and the eyes all work in concert to express ideas and so forth. And one person watching John Wesley preach said he was as evidently as an actor as Garrick, and he's referring to David Garrick, who was the leading Shakespeare. You didn't want to follow from month to month, right? I mean, if every month you could choose a different 2 commandments you didn't want to follow, you could do this. I mean, and that, you got to admit, that's part of the problem with marketing, is that marketing tries to determine what products you're going to sell, right? One of the brilliant things about Apple, and frustrating also, I love Apple products, by the way. You'll see it. All the junk I've got here is Apple, and so glad to see the Lutherans into Apple and Mac and so forth. But Steve Jobs, who later came to be called Jobs, he was very clear they weren't going to listen to any public marketing people about what they were just going to tell them what they loved and convince them that and they did that. So that's the other side of marketing, is that you can convince people to like the things that you already do, rather than asking the public what it is that they want and making your product sort of fit to the public. Mainline churches have utilized contemporary marketing processes, but haphazardly, I would say, more often continuing conventional processes of communications rather than what I've come to learn is a fuller process of marketing. Now, you're probably saying he's a historian, he's not a marketer. What has he got to do with this? So let me tell you what I've got to do with this. First, when I became president of theological school in the year 2001, at one of the first board meetings I attended, my board instructed me as the president that I would put in place a department of marketing and communications, which I proceeded to do, and hired a brilliant woman who knew all about marketing, and she became my tutor. She basically taught me, this is what marketing does. Denomination, even Bishop Kevin, you've got your specific area here. But what is it that you, as an evangelical Lutheran church group in North Texas and northern Louisiana, what is it that you want to communicate? See, what you'll do is if you had a meeting to define that, you'd come up with a list of 28 things, and that won't work, okay? Sooner or later, you're going to have to come down to two or three key things that you want to hammer away at in everything you do. If you don't, you face the challenge that one institution, which I'm not going to name, but to which I have been very close, consistently has done. Every church newsletter you get, every email blast, everything has a different set of images and a different set of messages that it's conveying. Every week, there's something different. It's this. Here's the emphasis this week. Here's the emphasis there. The only thing that's consistent is the logo of this particular congregation, and it's used inconsistently. Actually, one time I said, could I put that logo on my Sunday school class material? And the communications people said, oh, no, you can't put that on your Sunday school class material because you might offend other people in other classes who think they ought to use it. And you see, if you're in marketing, what you want is absolute consistency over and over and over. Coca-Cola is not going to change that red cursive Coca-Cola logo, even though children are no longer taught cursive. Did you know that, by the way? They don't teach cursive anymore. That's becoming it's kind of like an alien script these days. But Coca-Cola is going to stick with that. UPS and I don't think they found out what might be the negative effects of that message. And I think one of the negative effects is that it has actually harmed us in the sense of creating the sense that the United Methodist Church is a group that's proud that it stands for nothing. And as I often say, if that's the case, we have no... Why would anybody invest any time or energy or anything in a group like that? Rapidly redesigning media in response to feedback. Several institutions I know have spent a lot of money to get a new web page. You've done this in recent years. I know you're a web page designer here. Good. But what I've learned from my daughters, okay, now this is going beyond the media person I had back in the early 2000s, but my daughters are part of groups that listen to feedback daily and change their website within a week or two because they're adapting to what they're hearing. And I don't mean, again, cutting the 10 Commandments down to 8 or something like that. What I really mean is, if it's not communicating your key messages, if those are not getting across, then you redesign it so those messages are getting out there. My daughter, Elizabeth, in Houston, reads something called Google Analytics every morning. It looks like the most incredibly complicated set of charts that you've ever seen. But it tells you how many people are clicking on this page, how many levels deep do they go into your web page, what demographic are they, what group are you attracting, and it sort of tells them how they can experiment with new demographics and working with new groups. I'd like to see collaboration between ecumenical, denominational, and congregational marketing efforts. One of the criteria that I would set is that churches ought to get so much focus on what Holy Mother Church teaches. Holy Mother Church teaches this, Holy Mother Church, the Catholic Church teaches this, the Catholic practices that, so forth, that the priest's voice is almost lost, right? The priest is almost invisible, and sometimes the contemporary situation is invisible like that. I would say we have gone way too far the other direction. It's basically what I think is this and what I think is that, and let's think about what I think about this and what it's just the sermon is a stream of individual thoughts trying to relate the Bible to the contemporary situation. But in that and I'm going to indict my own group here, we seldom speak on behalf of the United Methodist Church when we do that. Or, I'd say even more importantly, our broader ecumenical commitments. The fact that we have a full communion agreement with the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America is almost invisible in the United Church. Mergers. The problem I see now, though, is that with national level church budgets shrinking, now not budgets across the board. I think churches are spending more and more on mission and congregations than they have in the past. But the national budgets that I know about are shrinking. And with that shrinking, everybody's defending their own turf. So they're defending the United Methodist stuff or the PCUSA stuff. And the ecumenical commitments tend to fall by the wayside. I think that's really unfortunate now and, again, just lacks visibility. That's where I might head with some of these things about edifying practices. I think I'm going to leave it at that point, and for the remainder of our time, I'm going to ask you to tell me about edifying practices or strengths of our. No, I'm kind of a defender of some of the traditional language and so forth, and in our own way of believing in the reality of Christ's body and blood and the sacrament, I don't want to compromise or give up something like that. But yeah, communicating that maybe is a difficult issue.
Since I became a pastor 30-some years ago, there was a shift, I think, about the time I was ordained in 1980. I have almost never performed a wedding over these years where the couple was not already living together.
Okay.
And the time of living together has now extended from, maybe we've moved in, now we're going to get married shortly, to now sometimes many years.
Yeah.
Of living together. And I think couples that are, cohabiting but not yet married, I